What's up everybody, I'm Grandmaster Ravensturt, and in this video we're going to be rewinding the clocks. We're going to be going back in time to the year 2007, in which Vladimir Kramnik, the reigning world champion, took on Magnus Carlsen, who was just a teenager. Now, going into this game, Kramnik had won the world championship from Kasparov in 2000. He defended against the very strong Grandmaster Peter Liko in 2004, and he defended it again in a very contentious and controversial world championship in 2006 against the Bulgarian Grandmaster Veselin Topalov. Meanwhile, at this time, 2007, this was very early on in Magnus's career. Magnus was only 17 years old. As we can see by the number next to Magnus's name, he was only around 2,700, but it was already clear to everyone who followed elite chess that Magnus was going to be the next sensation. So this really pitted two enormous titans of the game against each other. Vladimir had an insane rating going into this. He had 2811. He was definitely number one in the rankings at this point. Back in those days, only him, Topalov, and Anand were anywhere in the 2800s, and this is after Kasparov had retired in 2005. So this game was played in Dortmund. That's a town in Germany, and it was played, I think, in the hills of Bavaria. It was played in the frolicking and the very green meadows. And yeah, there was this classic tournament that was held there in Dortmund every single year. I think it's still going, but it might have, it's definitely gone down in size. It was very popular, and it had some of the strongest players year after year until maybe 2015, and perhaps due to funding it got canceled, or it at least got heavily downsized. So let's get into the game. The game is super interesting. This game, Kramnik goes for a classic positional style. Kramnik is like the historical chameleon. You really don't know what you're going to get. He can come at you one day with a super tactical, super aggressive, super feisty attitude. Then other days he adopts a super positional approach. This was back in a period when he was just a super positional player, and so he's going to go for the Catalan. So Kramnik goes white. Kramnik started with knight f3. Carlsen played knight f6, c4, e6, g3, d5, d4, bishop e7, bishop g2. We have the basic queen's gambit, but with quite a twist. White has elected for the kingside fianchetto by playing g3 and bishop g2. And this is a superpositional system. This was named after the Catalan region of Spain, which saw this played in a tournament, I think in the 1930s. And yeah, one of those really famous guys, I think it was Tartakower. He's the one who played the system all the time in that Catalan tournament, and because of that, this was named the Catalan. I guess Tartakower got screwed out of getting his name on this for some reason, and instead it just went to the region. So black castled here, white castled, black played d takes c4, white played queen c2, white's going to regain the pawn. White does not want to let this pawn stay on the board forever, of course. Black just snatched it. a6, the queen recaptures on c4, the pawn goes to b5, and the queen comes to c2. I really love this position because I think it highlights some really key principled aspects of positional chess. Whenever you have a position in chess and you look at your structure, if you want to figure out where the structural weaknesses are, sort of look at your pawns like a continuous function. For those of you who've taken math class, a continuous function is just more or less a function. It's like a line that doesn't stop. A discontinuous function is a line that stops. So if we look at white's pawns here, we have a continuous function, continuous, continuous. All of these are connected. This is connected. And then there's a break here, right? As we can see, there's a line that separates this pawn from this one. What I tell all of my students is that in order to avoid having more weaknesses, it's best to just try to always keep your pawns more or less like a continuous function. There are going to be some exceptions. There are definitely going to be some times when you break the rules, and there are going to be some times when you see grandmasters break the rules. But as a going rule of thumb, it's good to just keep your pawns more or less together, because this way you're maximizing the amount of pawns defending pawns. You want to delegate the roles of pawns and the defensive duties of them to the lowest common denominator, right? You don't want your queen. You don't want the queen of your army, the strongest force in the battlefield, just, delegated with defending a measly pawn. That's not going to make any sense. So instead, you want the pawns defending the pawns. So here we see that white has a slight break in the structure between these two. Black, on the other hand, has some much bigger breaks. He has a difference between this and this. And the reason that that's quite different is that we are looking straight down the c-file. We have an open c-file here. And the open files are where our rooks are going to be able to lay siege to the weak pawns. If you want to immediately identify where you have a weak pawn, literally just look for the open file that your opponent has, and pray dearly that it's pointed into a pawn that you can defend with another pawn. In this case, white has nothing to worry about. Black has an open d file, but this is just pointed at our pawn. We can easily reinforce this with e3, so there are no problems. But now looking at black is in a bit of a pickle here. This pawn is on an open file, but how is it ever going to be defended? There's no d-pawn on the board. So what? It can't go to c6 and expect an imaginary d-pawn to help it out. Meanwhile, how is the b-pawn going to help out? The b-pawn's advanced way too far. Not only that, because the b-pawn has moved from b7 and b6, these squares are both extremely weak. They're outposts, pretty much. And we're going to see Kramnik ruthlessly abuse all of these weaknesses here. I really love this opening because it's such pure positional chess. You're going to see this in a lot of positions, though it's most defined here in the Catalan. Pretty much, what does black need to do to be able to survive? And so first of all, black has the weakness here, and black has the two weak squares on c5 and c6. Why are those so weak? Well, simply put, no pawns can defend them, and also no rook can defend them. Keep in mind, if a rook were to ever come to c8, it's never going to be able to look over the pawn. And so because of that, as long as white can just simply put a knight here, put a knight there, and dig into that c5 square, their rooks will never be able to fight us, as long as we get it in before the pawn. So I know this has been a bit of a lecture, this has been a bit of a ramble, but this is one of the most important positional lessons that you'll probably ever hear. How does black deal with this? Pretty much, if you see a lot of weak squares in front of a weak pawn, just push your pawn on top of the square that makes some tension. Move the pawn on top of the square that begins a pawn break. In this case, a pawn break would be elected from c5, so the entire crux of black's position is if he can play c5. If somehow or another he can play c5, the position is going to be completely equal. Let's say somehow he was able to play c5, takes, bishop takes. Of course, I know this is a blunder. I don't want to hear any emails. I know that the queen can take, but this is just an example. In this case, like let's say that white wasted a move here and black goes back. Black would be completely fine now. Black will play bishop b7 to aim against our bishop. His bishop is good. The structure is more or less symmetrical. There are no obvious weaknesses for black. And think about where all those weaknesses were. Well, first of all, the weak pawn is gone. And secondly, with these two squares, we don't have a pawn anymore that was weighing down on that square. And moreover, their rook can now look straight down the file to cover any weaknesses that we try to exploit. So all in all, this is a super important positional rule. If you have weak squares in front of a weak pawn, just move the pawn onto the square that makes the break and try to trade it as quickly as you can. Because if you don't trade it quickly, your opponent is going to bear down on that square and make sure that that break can never happen. So black plays bishop b7. This is the classic theory. Black wants to just somehow, sooner or later, get c5 in. And now Kramnik went for a very positional move. This is not the main line, I think, anymore. Now the main line is bishop g5. But back in the old days, people really loved this bishop d2 move. Really crafty grandmaster chess right here. The idea is that the bishop is scoping out this a5 square. And it's sort of just a waiting move. It's sort of like Rambo, waiting in the wilderness to strike at the unsuspecting opponent. The idea is that we might go to a5, but we're not even going to do it yet because they could just kick us out with knight c6. The whole idea, though, is that they don't want to play knight c6. Instead, they want to play knight bd7, but if they go knight d7, we play bishop a5, zooming down on the queen. A really nice line I like is if they play rook c8, we can just play knight bd2, they play queen e8 to get out of the pin, and they're finally ready to push c5. So what do you think white should do here? I remember being stunned by this back when I first started studying the Catalan when I was just a teenager. I think I was like 14 or 15. b4. Unbelievably beautiful move. Look at this. It just completely digs into this square. Black is never going to achieve this push. Black can just sort of sit on his thumbs. He's never going to be able to get this pawn two squares. He's going to have to settle for the fact that it's weak. This is such a committing move, though. Look at that. It's just drilling in the bishop here. The bishop will never be able to do anything else. But the bishop is actually quite good. Think about it. We're attacking this pawn, and if black ever pushes, we're drilling into this square, which is going to be important for black to fight for their only open file. So all in all, I think this is one of the most positional the most strategically deep openings you could ever have. And I remember just having my socks rocked by this when I first saw it as a positional novice. So Magnus plays knight c6. This was one of the several ways that people thought that you could deal with this. He's attacking the pawn. Kramnik defends with e3. And, you know, while this looks sort of active, he has not dealt with the big positional problem. As long as this pawn is on the board, the square is going to be super weak, right? As long as that pawn is on the board, that square is never going to be able to be attacked or defended by a rook. So he plays knight b4. He wants to get out of the way. He wants to do a couple knight hops, maybe a knight hop here, knight hop there. Definitely wants to get that pawn to c5. And Kramnik takes. Kramnik gives away the bishop pair. Kramnik is banking on the long term. Kramnik plays a3, bishop e7, knight d2. Kramnik is building up the pressure. If we look at this pawn push to b5, Kramnik is really putting on a master class here. He sees that both of these squares are going to be weak. Both of these squares can never be covered by this pawn. Both of these are outposts, and so the knight belongs on b3. The knight is going to go here or here, depending on the situation. Carlsen plays rook c8. He's going for it. He has to do it. He has to play c5. Now's the moment. If Kramnik just plays something like knight b3, Carlsen can just play c5, takes, and something like bishop d5, and this is going to easily fizzle out. Even though for the moment Carlsen is down a pawn, he's just going to take here, chop on c5, and, you know, he can make a draw with old Kramnik. So instead white plays b4. Beautiful move. Digging into c5 once again. The c5 push is never going to happen. And Carlsen, though, Carlsen's at 2700. He knows what to do. He knows if he does not play quickly, if he does not rush, if he does not strike while the iron's hot, c5 is just going to evaporate. There's not going to be any hope of c5, and black is going to have to suffer this enormous positional... I'm not even sure what the lockdown, that would be a good word for it. So something like bishop d6, knight b3, let's say that black just doesn't fight it, queen e7, rook c1. This is a disaster. The knight can come to c5. This knight can reroute to e1 and d3. That's a very classic idea. And long term, white is just going to be able to play upon black's many weaknesses. Sooner or later, when this knight moves off the board, these bishops are going to go. And once that bishop goes, a new weakness has appeared. This a6 pawn becomes very vulnerable. We could easily see the knights coming to d3, c5, and then all of a sudden this pawn is just going to drop like an apple. So instead, Carlsen really fights the tide. He plays a5. The idea is really smart, and the idea is completely sound. If takes, c5, white's up a pawn for the moment, but this one is easily going to drop, and black has achieved his positional goal. He's achieved c5, no more weakness left. Carlsen might have to make a few more accurate moves, but then he can take a draw. So instead, Kramnik really surprises him. So knight e5, knight d5. Kramnik wants to dig in, and notice what Kramnik is going for. Kramnik realized that c5 was weak, but c6 is also extremely weak. Kramnik would really love to get this type of position here where he can dig into this square. We're going to see something like this a bit later, but keep in mind what I was talking about with the continuous function thing, right? These pawns are sooner or later going to get traded. Like, let's say that something like this happened with this. With this knight here, yeah, that doesn't deserve the red color. It's a beautiful knight. With this knight here, these pawns can never, ever be connected. As we're going to see in the future, the continuous function is always ruptured there, and because of that, both these pawns are going to forever be weak. Black would love a situation in which this pawn could come to c6. Then the pawn would still be weak, but at least then b5 would be completely safe. As we're going to see, once Kramnik asserts this domination over the c6 square, the game just goes belly up for Carlsen. So Kramnik wanted to trade off the bishops to really gain full control over the c6 square. Black plays knight d5, and now white goes knight b3. White's really running in there. White wants to play knight a5 with a tempo. Black takes the pawn. He thinks he's winning a pawn, but that's no concern for Kramnik. His steed needs to go graze. The steed is going to go to a5 and then c6. Knight a5, bishop a8, knight c6. Pressuring down, attacking the queen, and it does look like he's going to recapture the pawn sooner or later. Carlsen trades, queen d7, and now if Kramnik traded here, black would take. Kramnik can sort of play bully ball here with this, but at this point so many things have been traded and it is an opposite colored bishop ending, Carlsen would have fantastic chances of drawing. Instead, Kramnik made another really instructional move here. He did not take on b4. Instead, he traded what was supposed to be his good bishop. Look at this beautiful Catalan bishop. They're all the pawns supported on the dark square, so the bishop can dominate the light. But now Kramnik realizes you gotta crack a couple eggs to make an omelet. Takes. Queen cannot take because the bishop would be hanging. Instead, pawn takes. Now Kramnik can regain the pawn on b4 happily. There's no knight to attack this now. And here we get to a position very similar to that variation I discussed. This knight is digging into this square, and it's creating a discontinuous function here between the pawns. Because of that, each of these three is going to be massive targets. Yeah, we're having a little Christmas tree here with the lights and the colors. So because of this, Kramnik can win very easily. I bet at this point now Kramnik did realize that the game was completely over here, and Carlsen probably did as well. This was just an enormous positional blunder by Kramnik, or no, not by Kramnik, by Carlsen, and so everyone involved at Grandmaster level just knows that, you know, once the knight is able to dig into this square and completely break this continuity between the pawns, it's all completely over. Rook f8, rook a5, Kramnik is starting to collect. The bishop goes to f8, and now Kramnik actually dodged a few bullets here. If he takes on b5, Black is going to play rook e6, rook h6. He's also attacking the knight, so he's doing this with a tempo. And the rook is going to come to h6, the queen is going to come to h3. All of a sudden, Black's got some tricks. So instead, Kramnik just did not make any mistakes. This is world champion 2800 GIGACHAD level Kramnik right here. He plays knight e5, pushing the queen around. Queen goes to e6, and now he can snack on b5 completely unrestrained. Black, at this point, I'm sure Carlsen probably already knew that he was going to lose. He already knew that the game was going completely downhill. The really beautiful thing about this whole continuity stuff is that even when you start snacking on one pawn, none of the pawns become any safer. They're both very weak here. I'm sure Carlsen wanted to connect the continuity of his structure, but he realized that after c6, rook b6, there's just too much pressure on the c6 pawn, and he's going to be down 2 pawns here for completely nothing. So instead, Carlsen just tried to muddy the waters a bit. He played rook b8, white took, black took, and now white crashed through on c7. So it looks like Carlsen only lost 1 pawn because Black can play bishop d6, queen a5, and bishop takes b4. And Carlsen is only down a pawn here, but look at the difference in the pawns. Black has a completely healthy structure, or sorry, not Black, but White. White has a completely healthy structure. Look at that continuity there. h2, g3, f2, e3, d4. Beautiful pawns. Meanwhile, Black has still a big break in the pawns. There's that pawn on d5 is going to be super weak. And so effectively, Black is completely lost here. There's as we're going to see, Kramnik wraps up the game with a really nice tactic. But even if Carlsen was able to sort of dodge these tactics and, you know, just stay surviving, the position's completely hopeless. This pawn is way too weak. Carlsen is eventually going to be down 2 pawns. Black plays rook b1. Bishop can't take because of the rook takes on b8, back rank checkmate. Queen d6, and Kramnik just plays the patient, the relaxed, the calm, queen a4. And now in this position, Carlsen just had nothing to do. Knight is going to come to c6, forking the rook and the bishop. Meanwhile, if Black tries to stop it with something like rook b6, then something like queen e8 should suffice. Queen e8, queen f8, queen takes. The bishop can't take because the rook is pinning the bishop to the rook. And meanwhile, if king takes, then this blunders to the knight fork. So in this position, Carlsen just resigned. He had nothing else to do. I hope you enjoyed this game. I remember seeing this game for the first time, and this really introduced me to how important positional chess was, how important it is to create a continuous function of your pawns. And more than that, it was one of the first things that really showed me this rule of, you know, when you got weak squares in front of a weak pawn, you got to put that pawn, push the weak pawn onto the square that creates tension with the enemy to trade it off and immediately get your rooks eyeing those previously vulnerable squares. So hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time.